For decades, scientists believed they understood the genetic roots of African Americans whose ancestors survived the Middle Passage. Then they tested Muhammad Ali. What his DNA returned was not what anyone expected. It was not the clean narrative of stolen African identity that his most famous act of defiance had implied, and it was not what historians had assumed. It pointed somewhere older, somewhere stranger, and it raised a question that genetics alone cannot answer. On the night of February 25, 1964, a 22-year-old from Louisville stepped into a Miami Beach arena as a heavy underdog and walked out as heavyweight champion of the world. Sonny Liston, a man whose presence alone had made grown fighters reconsider their careers, did not answer the bell for the 7th round. The sports world had no framework for what had just happened. 2 days later, Clay gave them something harder to process. He announced his membership in the Nation of Islam. Within weeks, he went further. Cassius Clay, he declared, was a slave name. Not his name, never his name. It was inherited from the Kentucky slaveholder whose family had once owned his ancestors. He had chosen something else. From that point forward, he would be Muhammad Ali. The name was his own. The old one had never been. The backlash was swift and sustained. But Ali was not performing defiance. He was making a precise historical argument, using his own identity as the primary evidence. The name Clay was not a neutral inheritance passed down through willing hands. It was a document of ownership carried forward through generations without anyone's consent and without any record of what had come before it. What Ali could not have known was how much deeper that erasure actually went. For most descendants of American slavery, the genealogical record collapses within 3 or 4 generations. Enslaved people were cataloged as property, rarely by name, almost never by origin. The specific nations, languages, and peoples of the African continent were systematically removed from the historical record the moment a human being crossed the Atlantic in chains. What arrived in America was a person. What was recorded was an asset. Ali reached for a new identity because the original had been deliberately destroyed. What he could not have anticipated was that science would one day reach further back than any document and return with something no one had predicted. Before DNA testing existed as a genealogical tool, the fragments of Ali's documented ancestry were thin and telling in equal measure. His father, Cassius Marcellus Clay Sr., was a Louisville sign painter and muralist, a man of local presence and considerable personal pride. His mother, Odessa Grady Clay, was quiet and deeply religious, a woman Ali would describe for the rest of his life with unconcealed devotion. The family was working class, church-going, and rooted in Louisville across several generations. But the roots, followed backward, grew harder to trace with every decade. The name Clay was the most visible artifact. It traced directly to Cassius Marcellus Clay, the Elder, a 19th century Kentucky politician who was, by the standards of his era, a contradictory figure, an outspoken critic of slavery who nonetheless enslaved people, a man whose name now ran through a Black Louisville family as a permanent record of that contradiction. Ali knew this history. It was precisely what made the name feel less like an inheritance and more like a brand. The name Grady told a different story, or at least suggested one. Grady is an Irish surname, derived from the Gaelic O'Gradag. Its presence in a Black Kentucky family was not unusual. Irish surnames had entered African-American family trees through various historical channels across the South and border states, but no one in the family could say with certainty when that name had arrived, or through whom, or under what circumstances. 2 names, 2 entirely different historical trajectories, and behind both of them, the same impenetrable silence. Whatever lay beyond the reach of Louisville's church records and Kentucky's courthouse archives could not be recovered by research alone. The answer, if it existed at all, would have to come from somewhere else entirely. In 2006, Henry Louis Gates Jr. brought Muhammad Ali into a project that was equal parts scholarship and excavation. Gates, a Harvard literary scholar and cultural historian, had spent years developing what would become one of American public television's most significant genealogical series. African American lives used a combination of traditional archival research and genetic testing to trace the ancestry of prominent Black Americans, people whose family histories had been fractured by slavery, migration, and the systematic destruction of documentary records. The premise was straightforward. The results were rarely straightforward. Ali was among the most recognizable figures Gates approached. He was also, genealogically speaking, among the most challenging. The Clay and Grady family lines offered some documentation in the Louisville area, but both trails thinned rapidly as researchers pushed further back through the 19th century. Court records, church registries, and census data could carry the family only so far before the records simply stopped. Not because the people disappeared, because the system that recorded them had never been designed to preserve their full humanity. Gates turned to two complementary tools. The first was mitochondrial DNA, passed exclusively from mother to child through every generation, unchanged by the father's contribution. The second was Y chromosome analysis, which traces the direct paternal line with similar precision. Together, the two tests could illuminate the outermost branches of Ali's family tree, the deep maternal line running back through Odessa Grady Clay, and the deep paternal line running back through Cassius Sr. What the test could not do was fill the space between those lines, the vast middle of any family tree, the grandparents of grandparents, the collateral branches, the unnamed ancestors who contributed equally to a person's genetic makeup would remain beyond reach. The question was whether the outermost branches alone could tell a story worth hearing. The Y chromosome results arrived first, tracing Ali's direct paternal line, father to grandfather to great-grandfather, stretching back through generations that no Louisville courthouse had ever fully recorded. The analysis returned a clear and unambiguous signal. Ali's deep paternal ancestry was West African. The genetic signature placed his direct male line among populations whose descendants had lived for centuries along the western coast of Africa, in the regions that today correspond to Ghana, Nigeria, and the broader Gulf of Guinea coastline. This was not a surprise in the way that a contradiction surprises. It was a confirmation, but a confirmation of a kind that no document had ever been able to provide. Historians had long understood that the transatlantic slave trade drew the overwhelming majority of its captives from West and Central Africa. The American South, and Kentucky in particular, received enslaved people primarily from that corridor. What the Y chromosome test added was specificity. It did not simply confirm that Ali's paternal ancestors had been African. It placed them, with genetic precision, within a defined regional population whose history stretched back long before the first slave ship crossed the Atlantic. For Ali, who had spent decades asserting a connection to African identity that American history had done its best to sever, the result carried a weight that went beyond genealogy. The man who had rejected his slave name and declared himself a citizen of a broader African and Islamic world now had genetic confirmation that the ancestral connection he had claimed was real, measurable, and specific. But the paternal line was only half the picture. The mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line running back through Odessa Grady Clay, had not yet been analyzed. And when those results arrived, they would point in a direction that no one involved in the study had anticipated. The mitochondrial DNA results told a different story entirely, tracing Ali's direct maternal line back through Odessa Grady Clay, back through her mother, back through the generations of women whose names the historical record had largely failed to preserve. The analysis returned a haplogroup signature that had nothing to do with West Africa. The maternal line did not point toward the Gulf of Guinea or the Congo Basin or any of the population corridors, sources that the transatlantic slave trade had so devastatingly redirected toward the American continent. It pointed toward Ireland. The result was not ambiguous. The haplogroup identified in Ali's maternal line was consistent with populations from the British Isles, with the strongest concentration among people of Irish descent. And the Grady name, which had always sat quietly in the family record without full explanation, now had a genetic context. Grady is an Irish surname. The DNA confirmed what the name had only implied. This was not, in the broader context of African American genealogy, an anomaly. Genetic studies of African American populations have consistently found that the majority of people whose ancestors were enslaved in the American South carry measurable European ancestry, often between 15 and 30%, sometimes higher. That ancestry entered Black family trees through multiple historical channels, very few of them voluntary. Irish immigrants and laborers had settled across the American South and border states throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. The intersections between those communities and enslaved African Americans were frequent, complex, and almost entirely absent from the official record. But knowing the pattern existed across millions of people did not diminish what it meant in this particular case. The most famous assertion of Black identity in American sports history carried in its own maternal DNA the genetic signature of Ireland. And then there was the question the DNA could not touch at all. The Irish maternal line was confirmed, but the identity of the Irish ancestor who had entered that line, the specific woman, the specific union, or the specific moment in American history when that genetic thread was woven into the Grady family, remained unnamed. The DNA could confirm her existence. It could not give her back her story, whether she was a woman who had crossed the Atlantic by choice or one of the thousands of Irish women who arrived in America under conditions that offered very little of it. The record did not say. Whether the union that produced Ali's maternal line was the result of love, of coercion, or of the quiet desperation that characterized so many lives at the intersection of poverty and slavery in the American South, the DNA could not determine. What it could determine was this: Muhammad Ali, the man who spent his life demanding to be seen clearly and completely, came from a history more layered than even he had known. The question he had asked with his name change finally had an answer. It was not a simple one. What the DNA confirmed was not a contradiction of Ali's identity. It was a completion of it. He was African. He was Irish. He was American in the most complicated sense the word allows. The name he chose could not contain the full truth of his origins, and neither can any single label history has offered tense. What science returned was what slavery had taken. Not a simple story, but a true one. One question remains. We know the Irish line exists. We do not know her name.